Oh, alright. Huh. Looks like Rishi Sunak's saying some stuff. I guess I better actually listen into that.
And it is beyond alarming that last night the Rochdale by-election returned a candidate who dismisses the horror of what happened on October the 7th, who glorifies Hezbollah and is endorsed by Nick Griffin, the racist former leader of the BNP.
Huh. Wow, that guy sounds really bad. I better look into him and just see what the deal is with him. Let's see. Oh, it looks like an interesting video. Let's see what that is.
More tickles on the back, yes. Okay, I'll get you some milk. You stay there. I'll get you some milk and then I'll brush you. You like that, don't you? Good girl. Good pussycat, yes. Good pussycat.
God damn it. I'll go get the cat ears. On the 29th of February, Rochdale, a constituency in Greater Manchester, primarily containing the town of Rochdale, which, yeah, maybe a bit of a surprise, had a by-election. The next day, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, gave a rather incoherent speech outside Number 10, claiming that extremists are trying to tear Britain apart. He claimed that mob rule is replacing democratic rule, and that Rochdale's newly elected MP had a great number of things wrong with him. The by-election itself was a fiasco. It would probably deserve its own video, but the short version is that every established political party in Britain was roundly humiliated. Some through their own incompetence, like Labour and their initial backing and then sudden dumping of Azhar Ali over allegations of anti-Semitism, or the Reform Party selecting a former Labour MP who was accused of sending inappropriate messages to a teenager. No political party with parliamentary representation finished in the top two when the result came in. Second was taken by an independent candidate, but top spot was taken by notorious hat enjoyer and subject of this video, George Galloway. Why make a video about him? Firstly, he's a rare individual, one who has defeated major political parties in elections not just once, but multiple times. Secondly, I recently did a video on lesser evilism, and it looks like the people of Rochdale watched it. I'm just kidding. And I may not love the specific outcome, so we're gonna find out if I'm crying about getting what I wanted. Finally, I think the majority of the criticisms of George Galloway that you'll find easily aren't necessarily the ones that we need to focus on in particular. So if you want criticism of George Galloway for things like whether he's an extremist who's undermining Britain and whose election is somehow a descent into mob rule, that's not what this is. He won. He gets to be the MP for Rochdale, at least until the next election. Don't like it? Win next time, I guess. Or if you want me to fixate on him having a Russia Today associated show and meeting Saddam Hussein, this also isn't the video for you, because I think those criticisms are made elsewhere and across the political spectrum, and that he's tried to answer those questions. It's up to you to decide whether those answers were satisfactory, but nonetheless he has tried to answer them. I'm also not terribly bothered by the fact of him sending two different letters to people from, that his campaign identified as having different backgrounds. I have problems with the content of at least one of those letters, which I'll get into later, but he's not espousing mutually exclusive positions in them. He's not contradicting his stated positions, and micro-targeting, where you try to focus campaigning resources and target small groups, isn't illegal. If you have a problem with the fact of micro-targeting and not with the content, then I don't really think this is going to be for you. What I want is to figure out the answer to a couple of questions. Why is it George Galloway who always seems to emerge whenever the left is isolated from the political mainstream in the post-Iraq War world? How far does critical support extend? What does this say about us that George Galloway is the one who keeps doing this? And where should we maybe draw the line of who is and isn't on or of the left? I also want to talk about just kind of a weird guy who's a land of contrast, and it seems only fair to start things off with where the guy got things right, because it makes the actual points of criticism kind of more difficult to understand and more of a challenge, really. But before we get into it, I just want to say I am turning 30 next month on the 3rd of April, and it's my dream. My dream birthday present would be to get to 1,500 subscribers before I turn 30. So if you've enjoyed the video so far, or if you have enjoyed other videos and you're coming back, just hit the subscribe button. It's free, and it will really make turning 30 a lot easier. Also, do like, comment, share the video, all of the good stuff. But let's get into George Galloway. If this guy keeps showing up and exploits left dissatisfaction, then there must be some kind of merit to him, or at least that's what I would think makes the most sense. What are the merits of George Galloway? This is kind of a big question, as it would be with anyone who's been in politics for 40 years. 40 years is a lot of time, and I don't want to make this an origin story because I think those are boring. The two things I don't like, they're pilot episodes and origin stories, but I think I've boiled down his merits to 3 main areas. 1, he's charismatic and wields that charisma as a very effective weapon against people who are generally disliked. 2, he speaks to issues of inequality well and knows how to target an unpopular economic orthodoxy. The main one since the 2010s has been austerity, which has fed a lot of the dissatisfaction that he exploits nowadays. 3, the parts of his foreign policy positions he chooses to center. I'm not going to sit here and say that Galloway has nailed it on foreign policy, but he very publicly called the Iraq War correctly, is very vocally pro-Palestinian, and by virtue of the fact that if you're just kind of primitively anti-America, you call it right like 95% of the time, he's dined out on this combination among certain sections of British public opinion for 20 plus years. Is that enough to mean that you get to be a part of the left and use the resources of the left? That's kind of what we're trying to figure out in this video, I suppose. To start with, let's talk about that charisma. He's just kind of good at cutting through bullshit. Or, to be a bit more precise, he's good at giving the appearance of cutting through bullshit. The thing about being the kind of person who can appear to do that is it gets you a lot of leeway when you don't necessarily have a lot to say. I'm not saying that all George Galloway does when he speaks is cut people down to size while avoiding saying anything, but it's pretty handy that he has that gift and that he applies it against targets who kind of deserve it. A good recent example of this is the way that he responded to a Sky News journalist's questions in the aftermath of his victory in Rochdale. It's a great blueprint for rejecting the attempt by the journalist to take the moral high ground, and to be honest, the journalist wasn't asking very good or very serious questions in most of this. I'll share a minute or so of it with you now so that you can get a sense of what I mean.
A lot of people have just watched what the Prime Minister said. This is your opportunity to respond to what he said. Well, he says that there are forces here at home trying to tear us apart. He is implying you are a divisive figure. You have run an election campaign that has tried to appeal, particularly, not entirely, to one section of the community.
Who won the election? Me or Rishi Sunak? I've got the Democratic mandate here, not Rishi Sunak. He didn't even come second. He was lucky to come third. So don't put to me statements made by Rishi Sunak as if I'm supposed to be impressed by them. He don't impress me much.
We at Sky have spent some time today on the streets of Rochdale, and there are people who say that they feel intimidated by people like you and the people that have supported you.
I have just
and they have pointed out that you have concentrated your campaign on foreign affairs, and they worry that Rochdale will not be the winner.
That's my answer to you. I was just elected with a thumping majority by the electorate in Rochdale. That's all that matters to me.
I believe, as someone who thinks you should treat people, particularly journalists, with the contempt they deserve, especially if they're deliberately being stupid, I can see what the appeal is here, right? Especially when you think of recent experiences of the British left with the press and the feeling that high-profile leftists who are in politics held back a little bit. The appeal here is ultimate catharsis. Watching Sam Coates get spoken down to like the dipshit he is satisfying. Of course, the other side of this coin is that you can use this to avoid scrutiny, but come on, this section is the good stuff. Why am I being such a downer? Let's just keep going, huh? I will say that this direct manner of communication, habit of wanting to tell journalists that they're not really doing their job, and the idea of himself as a straight talker has led to him becoming possibly the most quotable British politician of the past 30 or 40 years, whether it's his comment during the Rochdale by-election that Jimmy Savile wasn't a Muslim, which I just kind of want to get that on a shirt. It's such a banger line. Like, you can't deny it's a banger line. Or this quote of him following a scandal about an extramarital affair in Greece that I'm going to read in full because I'm still not quite sure this is real. I travelled and spent lots of time with people in Greece, many of whom were women, some of whom were known carnally to me. I actually had sexual intercourse with some of the people in Greece. That's apparently real. God damn it. Sorry, I just had to recover a little bit there. Another source of his appeal, and something that I think is potentially good, is that he seems to generally be on the left. When he was a Labour MP, and I get it, he was a Labour MP, but you have to start somewhere sometimes. He was always considered a figure that was somewhat on the left of the party, though he was never a part of the sort of parliamentary organisation of left MPs, the Socialist Campaign Group, which, to be fair, may not necessarily have played out against him in the long run. This means he's had a lot of credibility, because to be on the left in the period of time when he was in politics wasn't easy, because every single major party had essentially conceded that the current economic orthodoxy we live under is basically it. This is it. This is as good as it gets. Isn't that wonderful to hear? There is no better way. And of course, you can try to present alternatives, but seriously believing in them or not compromising from there marked you out as primarily a kind of childish outsider. But there was a time when that was charming and cute, like me and the cat is. Nowadays, it tends to mean that you get called all sorts of things, but I'm getting away from my point, which is that the economic model we live in has made things worse and worse, and that credibility can pay off in big ways when that's the case. Take George Galloway's big win at the Bradford West by-election. A lot of people will point to all sorts of things as the reason why he won, typically referring to the large Muslim population. But Galloway won 56% of the vote, so if it was all about the Muslim community, that doesn't make sense. There's some element missing to that. My hypothesis is that he had enough credibility from his past and his contemporary economic positions to attract people who are fed up with both major parties having essentially the same economic policy. That's my hypothesis. Not that, like, it played no role, the Muslim community stuff, but it probably didn't play an outsized role in his victory. He's broadly kept this line, and you can see that in the Workers' Party's materials. They have this handy 10-point program, where you can see that this is still clearly on Galloway's mind and part of this political constitution. Now, the party is not Galloway, and Galloway is not the party, but since he's the leader of the party, I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that he at least aligns significantly with its stated policy. Otherwise, he'd probably quit. I know it's lacking details, but the broad strokes of some of this stuff can be quite tempting. and definitely overlaps with both contemporary electoral leftist policies and can potentially represent big breaks with the current economic orthodoxy in the UK. Decent, cheap, secure housing for all, that's quite literally not on offer from either major party. High quality free childcare and education? Sign me up! Free and comprehensive healthcare? That's cool. Better than privatization and private sector involvement for sure. Those are a handful of examples from the 10-point program, and while there are definitely parts I'm a bit like, you need to explain what you mean by this exactly, or I'm just not particularly trusting of this coming from a Galloway-led outfit, but, you know, that stuff's for later on. Finally, the part of his appeal that people attribute a lot of his success to is the fact that he's very loud about foreign policy in a way that's drawn a lot of attention to how he's called some very high-profile issues that the British public have broken with the political establishment on correctly. The two big ones he gets credit for are being against the Iraq War, and in fact he was kicked out of Labour in a politically motivated disciplinary process where the charges included inciting British troops to defy orders on the grounds that they didn't have to obey orders that amounted to a war crime, which, frankly, if you're gonna get kicked out of a party, that's a pretty good reason to have it happen. You can see why people look at that, and at his infamous hearing with the US Senate where he pulled the same stunt he did with the journalist from earlier, treated them with the contempt they deserved, and perhaps skillfully avoided giving some direct answers, but the sense was that he came out of it looking really good, so good that he's actually posted the full hearing on his YouTube. It lends a lot of credibility to his image as an anti-American, anti-imperialist, anti-war figure. It's also helpful that in the case of the Iraq War, he aligned with a significant, frustrated, and underrepresented section of British public opinion, which was so significant it gives him credibility to this day, among some. And that the British public at large, to be honest, did come to agree with the anti-war position as time went on. The other big foreign policy position he dines out on is his support for Palestine, a position that is consistently in line with majority opinion in the UK against pretty much all of the major political parties in the UK. Which helps if one of your favourite lines that you keep deploying is how Labour and the Conservatives are two cheeks of the same arse. It also helps if you consistently choose to run in areas with higher Muslim populations, since the British political establishment's indifference to Palestinian suffering is often read as indifferent to British Muslims suffering. Which I would say is a correct analysis. It does open doors for Galloway, but I don't want to overstate the case for a couple of reasons. One is that British Muslims, by and large, care about the same issues as the general population in Britain. You know, things like the cost of living, the NHS, education, those kinds of things, right? Has Palestine become an important issue for some reason recently? Yeah. Have some people sought to punish the major parties for their support of Israel? Also, yes, it's a factor, but I have my doubt that it's the one factor to rule them all. I also believe that overstating this case risks letting ourselves fall into the idea of bloc politics with regards to minority groups, and I can assure you that there are non-Muslims in the UK who care about Palestine. Some even live in Rochdale, who maybe even voted for George Galloway. And there will be plenty of people who voted for him for a lot of diverse reasons. So let's not lean too hard on this as an analytical crutch, is kind of what I'm saying. But it is also relevant to his general appeal, especially in the context of a broad political consensus in the West in favour of restricting speech and protest on the issue, and the prominence that the issue gained after Jeremy Corbyn became Labour leader. Whether we think that's for good reasons or bad reasons, I'll leave that to you. But what Galloway provides is catharsis. To see someone speak so plainly and directly in support of Palestinians when a lot of people are being told it's illegitimate. He is great at expressing outrage about that particular topic. With all of that said, you might be asking yourself, okay, SK, you have a guy who's charismatic, treats journalists with contempt, is pro-Palestine, anti-America, has some left-wing economic ideas, and isn't in the Labour Party. He's everything you say you want. So why is the video still going? Are you crying about getting what you wanted? And to some extent, given I recently did a video about lesser evilism, yeah, maybe Galloway isn't exactly what I had in mind, so we need to talk about why that is. For this section, which I've titled The Bad, apparently in my script, because I can't stop watching westerns and letting them decide how I structure my videos, I wanted to focus on things that I think are bad, obviously, but either things that don't really matter too much, or are things that are quite easy to fix. Not all of this section is entirely serious, but these are all real things that at least point to some incompatibility between the kind of leftism that you and I would want to see put forward at the ballot box. Probably. If you've made it this far, that's probably the case. One of the idiosyncrasies Galloway's has is that he comes across as one of those self-identified leftists I talk about in my video about the monarchy, which is one that's probably a bit of a crypto-monarchist. But Galloway isn't really a crypto-monarchist at all. He comes across as kind of an open one at times. First, there's this tweet where he's openly sad about Elizabeth Windsor being dead, remembering an anecdote where he was a wine waiter. He also denied that he said that the Queen was an absurdity, which is a shame. He really should have called her, or at least the institution she embodied, an absurdity, because it is. Now, there are parts of this that I don't think are George Galloway specific. One is that unlike the majority of the public who queued to look at her coffin, George Galloway at least met her. So I can understand the degree of personal sympathy towards someone you met in the form of, yeah, I bet this sucks for the family, which you can also follow up with, but the institution is an absurdity and should be abolished, which you'd think a bold communicator like Galloway would be willing to do. The other part of this is that he's British. And look, he is a British nationalist. I mean, he supports unionism in Scotland, which is the idea that Scotland should not be independent, but he's clearly very in line with the mainstream of the party political consensus on Britain, its place in the world, and how the monarchy all fits into that. If you think a hereditary monarchy isn't absurd, and isn't an absurd thing to have at the top of a political system, then you kind of have to ask, what is your instinct going to be when you have to challenge other forms of hereditary privilege? This one, as I sort of said, isn't really serious to me, because this is just terminal Brit brain, rather than like a unique personal failing of his. There are plenty of British leftists, some that are actually self-declared Republicans, who made bigger tits of themselves on this issue. So yeah, it's superficial, it's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world. Another thing that's not the end of the world, at least if his career after this is any indication, because he was just fine after this, is going on Celebrity Big Brother. Look, I am also pretending to be a cat for the purposes of clout chasing, so I'm in no position to judge, but that cat bit I had in the intro is unfortunate, and so are the clips that are available of him hugging Jimmy Savile of not being a Muslim fame. Yeah, that's real. In fairness, George Galloway is not to blame for the Celebrity Big Brother casting. He also wasn't, for example, the head prosecutor whose job it was to make sure his organization prosecuted Jimmy Savile if allegations about him arrived at someone's desk. That's someone else. No one could possibly say who it is, so that's just me being silly. But also, to me, represents a flaw, which is that this man is a clout chaser. He has content creator brain. It'd be one thing if I decided to go on Big Brother, or I was interviewed by a journalist and referred to something I'd done as an epic clip, as Galloway did in his interview after his win after the Rochdale by-election. But I'm not running to be a member of parliament. I'm also not trying to be the figurehead of a wider left movement. His instinct to generate maximum publicity leads to videos titled George Galloway fawns all over Jimmy Savile, and to YouTubers having to pay £4 for cat ears. So, thanks George, that's £4 I could have used for like 80% of a pint, I guess. Ultimately, though, this instinct for clout chasing is something that I think does a disservice to the good elements of what he's sort of saying that he wants to achieve. You can have all the good politics in the world, which he doesn't, but if he did, he's still the guy who pretended to be a cat on Big Brother. Another thing to put in the bad column is something I kind of want to ask you about as the viewer. If George Galloway is so good at being an MP, why does he keep needing to use by-elections to get back into Parliament? I mean, seriously, look at the record for yourself. Ever since he was kicked out of Labour, he's been able to win seats, Bethnal Green and Bow, Bradford West, and now Rochdale. But he's never followed up those previous 2 victories before Rochdale with another victory at the next election. Now, part of this is almost certainly because, at least in the case of Bradford West, by-elections have a lower turnout, so they're easier to win. But one of those victories was at a general election, so while that may explain Bradford West, doesn't explain Bethnal Green and Bow. You might also think, well, he's a minor party candidate. He was representing Respect, which was a left-wing anti-war party. So the party may simply have not had the resources to compete with Labour in these seats at a general election. Which is, I think, a reasonable hypothesis, until you consider that the Green Party's sole MP at the time of recording, Caroline Lucas, has been in Parliament since 2010 and has represented the same seat throughout that time. Clearly, whatever you think of her or the Green Party of England and Wales, the people of Brighton Pavilion approve of her. Whereas the people of George Galloway's seats in his post-Labour career seem to want something different after a short time. One possible explanation is that he's just not very good at being an MP, or at least not committed to doing some aspects of the job. Now, I don't think Parliament is the be-all and end-all of politics, but if you've taken it upon yourself to represent people, the least you could do is show up. His attendance record for votes since leaving Labour is abysmal. The highest rate he's achieved before being elected as Rochdale MP while not being in Labour was 11.2%. Now, compare that to his obvious competitor for leadership of the left movement in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, and you find that even after he was kicked out of Labour, he's putting in an attendance rate in the low 60s. I know this isn't necessarily the whole story because those numbers don't account for deliberate abstentions, but on a basic level, I think if you intend to do the job of representing people, you should show up and maybe have an opinion about the business of the day. Like, what does abstaining deliberately do, really? Maybe you should have more opinions. I don't know, that's just me. In case you're wondering, pretty much every MP, if you just go on the Public Whip website and just click on random MPs, most of them manage to clock in a rate of at least 50%. As much as people may not notice whether their MP is voting or not, my suspicion is this trickles down to other parts of the job, and judging from how he's fared at retaining these seats in elections, I think I might be right. Now, that's speculation on my part, but I think I'm right. Finally, we come to the bad elements of the party platform. As I said earlier, since he's the leader of the Workers' Party, we can reasonably assume he approves of the manifesto section on his own party's website, which is where all of this information has come from. Throughout the manifesto, there's this cautious optimism about AI. And I will say this, cautious optimism is better than the Labour Party, who seem to think that a chatbot is going to replace GPs. But I also think that even cautious optimism isn't correct. I did a whole video about that, you can go check it out. But there's a section of the manifesto where they imagine a policy platform where they can create crypto and AI that operates in the interests of the working class, while also saying that it's too early to have a specific policy. Like, as I just said, I did a video about this. Trust me, it's not too early. I'm calling for a Butlerian jihad. We need to put an end to the thinking machines until we can figure out what's going on. This is something that they've left open-ended enough that I think that the reality of this might hit them and they could change their mind, but even cautious optimism feels kinda sus to me right now. The section on policing is real interesting with its choice of banner image, the word police in a rainbow pattern. Interesting. Wonder what they're trying to get at with that, but the worst part of it is an assertion they make. The assertion is that police are workers too, which is a pretty astonishing position to have, and is real, I like the communist cops energy. Also mentions of liberal laws that weaken the ability of police to protect the most vulnerable, which only begs the question, well, more than a few questions really. Which laws do you mean, and how do you envision police as being able to protect anyone? Part of this is just that electoral projects in the UK have to concede to this, apparently. And so you could just say, no, they're just lying to some imaginary Brit. But I find that both hard to believe and not incredibly comforting. Especially when you look at the section titled Mass Migration, where the bulk of it is just accepting the existence of borders, and I guess they mentioned that British anxieties about immigration are often stoked by the racist right, but they basically talk about migration in the same ways as the racist right. That particularly refugees are putting a strain on services and repress wages. If services are strained and wages are repressed, that's the fault of the government and capitalists respectively, and kind of jointly. Not the fact of refugees existing. Though I will say, unlike every other anti-immigration, anti-refugee party in this country, they at least seem to want to stop the wars that create so many refugees. So that's nice, I guess. It's just a shame that we'll continue to have a violent border regime if the Workers' Party and Galloway get their way. The party has also taken the debate pervert line, claiming they will make it a criminal offence to deny a political organisation or individual a platform, which is interesting. Does that apply to literally every political organisation or individual? Because that might open up some interesting edge cases. I'm sure that'll be fine. They claim, we are so confident of our position that we encourage debate with our opponents on equal grounds, which is cool, and I don't think they're lying to us when they say these things, but does the UK need a debate bro party? A friend of the show, by the way, John the Duncan, had the last word on debates, so if you want to learn what my position is, just go to his video. But the TLDR is, debate is for perverts, and I for one will not indulge it. Then, this manifesto has parts that have just gone off the rails, leading us to this section, the ugly. This is a climate change denialist manifesto. First, they want to have a referendum on net zero, which is just about the most stupid thing I've ever heard, but they do it on the grounds that it would impose costs on working households and small businesses, which, gee, if only this was a program for government. Maybe you could devise a path to net zero that doesn't do those things. I'm sure that there are plenty of people who have worked on that exact question, so, you know, what a shame no one's ever thought of this. Then there's language around climate change is constantly taking place. It has done so for thousands of years, which is this climate denialist line that's like factual, but also like not the point. Like, it's true, the climate has changed over geological time frames, not in 200 years and not with direct correlation with human activity. It also leans heavily on following the science, but also tries to wriggle out of that by talking about science as something socially constructed. It's incoherent, it's a mess. Also, there's a principle that maybe we don't have to have 100% certainty in the science and should just maybe do the thing anyway, because even if we're like wrong, what do we really lose if we handle this properly? Like, what are we talking about? A lot of the problems they identify with net zero are oddly the kind of things that are addressed as part of the rest of their program. So why resist it, right? Why put up this weird resistance? It just seems like a risky thing to do when we're already seeing the consequences of climate change. If it's the case that you believe it's real, as they claim to in the most roundabout way possible, just do the things. There's also no mention of LGBT people or groups in the manifesto at all, which, given the ongoing high-profile media campaigns against the community, and to be honest, some of George Galloway's own election materials in the by-election, seems to point in a particular direction, when you pair this with the manifesto's commentary about top-down, ideologically driven progressivism imported from the very different conditions in the US, you could understand if people feel a little bit nervous about the whole thing. Like, you could read this whole bit and you just know in your heart what it's about. You almost want to sit George Galloway down and have him explain what alien values are being imposed from above. The idea that trans people deserve to live their lives, the idea that racial and ethnic minorities shouldn't be discriminated against. The manifesto touts tolerance, especially the British working classes' tolerance. But speaking as someone who's lived in Britain's tolerance, I'm done being tolerated. It's a word that implies I'm some kind of imposition when all I want to do is live my life. This dovetails with the manifesto's 6 references to identity politics, all negative, of course. And now, I don't mean to say that identity politics, whatever you think that means, is an idea that's beyond criticism. Like, all ideas can be criticized. It's just that no one has ever really threaded the needle of critiquing identity politics without coming across a bit like they're an asshole. This manifesto fails to thread that needle too, talking about the import of identity politics into our small towns, which does sound a lot like something else if you stop and think about it a little bit. And this quote is especially unhinged. A malign alliance has emerged between increasingly unhinged identity politics and the neoliberal elite, where Frankenstein's monster, identity politics, now partially controls its former master, capitalism. Like, okay, do you really think that identity politics partially controls capitalism? Or have some factions of capital realized that gays and black people have money too? Like, which one of these do you believe is more likely? To be clear, I think that the ideas behind identity politics, I think you can critique them. I think that's fine. I just think that choosing to speak about it in this way makes it look like the Workers' Party, and by extension, its leader, are dickheads. Either say what you really mean, or stop talking about it, is my advice, I guess. We return with all of this to the man himself. When you're a figure who's seen as on the left, and you actually get into some kind of prominence, all kinds of shit gets made up about you, and Galloway is no stranger to controversies. Some unsubstantiated or just irrelevant, others are kind of relevant and actually pretty bad. One of these claims that you often see bandied around is that he's a sexist or a misogynist. And instinctively you might recoil because we have heard these accusations made towards another prominent left-wing politician. The thing is, those other politicians didn't try to claim that a woman lied about being forced into a marriage at the age of 15 and employed party surrogates to try to obtain information to discredit that woman. The whole campaign in the 2015 election that he was participating in was marred by this, and his campaign was widely described as misogynist and sexist, which, gee, I wonder why people may have believed that. It's just a despicable thing to say about someone, and if you think that Naz Shah, his opponent, was leveraging her experience for political gain, I mean, yeah, like, maybe it's relevant experience that could inform the electorate on their choice. Like, maybe there are people in the electorate who relate to this issue in some way and would prefer to have an MP who has lived through it and will advocate for them, as opposed to, you know, trying to discredit them. This looks especially bad in combination with his specific defense of Julian Assange, where he claimed that all he was guilty of was bad sexual etiquette. Now, you could make the point that it's interesting how ferociously Assange is pursued when the conviction rate for the crimes he's accused of are so low in the UK. But that's not what that comment is. This looks like someone who's defending the specific crime. He's also defended people like Russell Brand, claiming that they, among other people, have been framed by the establishment for criticizing Ukraine. I mean, there's a clip of his talk show that gets really out of hand because he talks about this and then goes on to claim that January 6th wasn't an insurrection, which is just a buffet of Gallowayisms, really. It's just kind of a tough watch, even if you find the guy entertaining. He then doubled down on the comments, which he's entitled to do, and everyone else is entitled to judge him on. It's also worth noting in the same story where he refused to apologize for his comments about Julian Assange, he had to apologize for using an ableist slur, while also using a word which he probably shouldn't have been using that's also kind of ableist in the process of apologizing for ableism. Just a real masterclass here from the guy. One of the hallmarks of George Galloway is that as someone with terminal content creator brain, he's really in it for himself. You can see it in the way that he appears in a place, stirs a bunch of shit up, and then fucks off from that place once he's bored or it no longer suits him to be there or the people just kick him out. Really, I think this partially explains those numbers from earlier where he's just not attending votes because he's spending time doing all sorts of other bullshit. He unashamedly targets his campaigns at minorities, particularly at the Muslim community. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with that, it does lead to some very odd moments, like this moment which I believe is at a hustings where he uses a slur and an anecdote. Now, in fairness, no one in the room seems to be very offended by it. People seem to be laughing along with the anecdote. And the point he's making in this is that people who are perceived as allies of minorities are often caught in the crossfire of racism. And that can happen. It's just that if I wanted to go in and stir a bunch of shit up and sort of exacerbate tensions, this is how I would behave. Just make the point you're making a different way. Like, I just explained it without saying a single slur. It can be done. One of his most unforgivable crimes, in my opinion, was telling people in Scotland to vote Tory. In fact, he's actually justified this since by saying in an interview with Owen Jones that voting Labour would allow the SNP to win seats. A logic that damns his own project. Oh, I know what the excuse is we'll win, we're a vehicle to punish whichever party you don't like. But ultimately, this is a logic that will be used by others to delegitimize the project he leads. So it's not just unforgivable for advocating for voting for the scumbag party that at the time was led by Boris Johnson, but plainly stupid as well. Those words were said after the 2019 election, so you can't even use the excuse that he didn't know he'd be a partisan politician at the time, so maybe he was just talking shit. These comments were made during the Batley Spen by-election. Then we come to the thing that he does that's identical to Labour. He clearly believes working class people, particularly white working class people, are just constitutionally bigoted. You can see this in the targeted letter he sent to white-sounding households in Rochdale, talking about having no difficulty in defining what a woman is. Now, he could mean a good definition, an inclusive definition, but we all know what that really means. He mentions grooming gangs, which is an Islamophobic dog whistle in a lot of contexts, particularly in towns where this controversy has been sort of had petrol put onto the fire of it. Small businesses, he mentions those. I mean, this letter is full of right-wing culture war slop. It almost looks AI generated, but I have to believe this letter is authentic because if it wasn't, some kind of crime has been committed. Just look at this and tell me that this isn't the letter of a dipshit right-wing culture warrior. He also decided to be racist to the now First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, or at least that's who I'm guessing Humza is. Alongside this weirdly intense picture of him, like, my god, he is looking into the soul of that camera. It's almost unnerving. We should move on. Now, I was all prepared to play devil's advocate here, but reading it again, I just can't. No one who's ever said to me, "You're not more English or British than me," has ever meant it to mean that me and the person saying it to me were equally British or English. Also, going on about being a Celt as if that's a requirement to be considered sufficiently Scottish to say whatever it is that's irked Galloway here, that's pretty fucking awful. That's just ethno-nationalism. Like, it's just weird, awful. Just don't do this. Don't support people who say these things. There's so many more things we could dig into in all of these sections. We could talk about his fondness for hanging out with far-right figures like Steve Bannon. We could talk about how he got the phrase spunk-loving sluts into Hansard, which I guess I've got to show you the clip because you're not going to believe me.
Did the Treasurer of the Labour Party, and I apologise to the Right Honourable Lady for the language I'm about to use, did the Treasurer ask if Mr Desmond was giving from the profits of spunk-loving sluts or Asian babes?
Or we could talk about how he thinks after independence Scotland could be partitioned. Which actually... Anyway, I'll leave it to you to decide which sections these things would have gone in, because much like George Galloway's career, this video has gone on for long enough. Whew, okay, well that was an awful lot, wasn't it? I suppose as some kind of conclusion, I need to try and think about those questions I asked at the start, and I've kind of ended up with some extra questions as well that I'll try my best to kind of address. Should George Galloway be considered worthy of your critical support? That's kind of the question that led me into this. Like, how far does critical support go? What is your price? Is your price that the guy is going to build cheap housing? Is that the price that you're willing to pay? Because I look at a lot of the things that made up the bad and the ugly sections of this video, and I just kind of can't help but come back to the idea that if this was a Labour Party, you know, candidate or person or personality or whatever who was doing these things, we would just bury them, right? We would run them into the ground. And so I do wonder why some people aren't reacting as strongly to Galloway as they would to, say, Keir Starmer, who aligns with Galloway on a lot of these things, like the transphobia stuff. Yeah, him and Starmer are like buddy on that stuff. That's like, he agrees with the British establishment on that issue. So why then do we not react like this? Is he worthy of critical support? I mean, that's a question you can only ask and answer for yourself. Like, I want to be clear as well. I just feel the need to extend a bit of an olive branch here. If you voted for George Galloway in Rochdale and you found this video, or you wanted Galloway to win because it would spite the Labour Party, I don't think you're a bad person. I don't think that you're, like, irredeemable. You're awful. I just think that maybe you are privileging wanting to dunk on someone more than the things that make up a good and sustainable left-wing political movement. Now, that's just opinion from me. That's not... You can decide to do what you wish. If you think George Galloway winning in Rochdale advances leftist causes, I can't really dissuade you from that, because I think anything I say will just annoy you. But really the question I have to ask is, if this is the best the electoral left can offer, what does that say about the electoral left? And doesn't that raise questions about, what are we doing? Like, why are we doing this? Why is a guy who's going around saying slurs, putting out transphobic leaflets, who just can't help but clout chase, why is this the guy? Why is he the guy, right? And you can say it's because of all of those things you said in the good section, but is that really enough? Is that enough? I don't know. I don't know if it's enough. I think my position on him is clear. I don't think he's anything to be admired as a whole package. Yes, there are things that he does that I find entertaining. There are parts of his party platform that are interesting. But if we would refuse to vote for Labour, as I suggest we should do in that video I did on Lesser Evilism, for a lot of these same reasons, why are we saying that the price is some of the stuff that Galloway does? Why is that an adequate price? I've not seen that justified. And so I guess I just want to leave it as an open question. If you have thoughts about that, drop them in the comments. It'd be good to get into a back and forth about it. But with that, I really need to end this video because I just don't see where else to go. So I need to thank my proofreader, who is my partner, who proofread most of this script, I also need to thank Emma for making the thumbnail for this video. The thumbnail for this video actually made me laugh out loud live on stream. It was just so good. I really, really, really liked it. I also need to thank my patrons, particularly the top tier patrons, Droneriff, Mercutio, Kersley Scheider, John N, and our YouTube member, Nadir Jiwa. If you want the videos a bit early, if you want to vote on some of the video topics, if you want to suggest video topics to me, if you want access to the super secret VIP bits of the Discord, you can go to patreon.com/skthecrusader, or you can become a member on here on YouTube. Also, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all of the good things. Get me to 1,500 subscribers by my birthday. Please, it would be the most wonderful present for turning 30. And with that, everyone, I need to say, God, these are really cheap cat ears. I really wish maybe I'd spent a couple of extra quid on it. But it is what it is. See you, everyone. Peace.